Governor Baker recently signed the first major readjustment in state funding for schools since the beginning of education reform in Massachusetts in 1993. The goal was to close funding gaps to narrow the gaps in achievement with a spending increase of $1.5 billion over 7 years. But the path to a breakthrough began even before last year with a legislative commission headed by our guest, State Senator Sonia Chang-Diaz. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me back, Chris.
I want to start with the governor's signing because he did this at the English high school. That was supposed to say something about this kind of funding. What exactly?
Yeah, I can't read the governor's mind. I can tell you what I interpret it as. First of all, the English high school is a storied, iconic place in our history as a nation, as well as a city and a state. It's America's oldest public high school. So I think that was significant, a sort of, recommitting ourselves to that historic legacy of public education in Massachusetts. And it has been, as you mentioned, a quarter century since the last time we really dug into this topic, and there was a lot of updating and a lot of recommitting that needed to be done. So I think, one, it was significant in that historic sense. Also, the whole thrust of this bill is about tackling and closing those really persistent and pretty cavernous opportunity and achievement gaps we have in Massachusetts. And the student population at English High School is exactly who we're targeting with this bill, right? Low-income students, students of color, English language learners, new Bostonians, new Americans, new Bay Staters. And so I think it was really significant in that sense that that the bill signing was held at a location that is entirely populated by the students that this bill is meant to serve.
Now, one other way of measuring this is that I know that earlier this year when Mayor Walsh was trying to give an argument for this money, was that if this doesn't pass, Boston would have been, I guess, going backwards in terms of state funding.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. There are impacts for literally every single district across the state in this bill. But Boston was certainly in, a fairly unique and dire situation. If you looked out a few years, had we done nothing, that Boston would have been getting essentially negative state aid for its public schools because of a combination of factors to do with how much local property tax wealth we have in Boston, and also charter school funding in Boston. So long story short, there are going to be tens of millions of dollars worth of new state aid for Boston, if not over $100 million once it's fully phased in 7 years. So this will be not as significant a game changer as in other communities across the Commonwealth. In some cases, like Springfield, for example, they'll see virtually a doubling of their state aid. But in Boston, it is going to be really meaningful, between probably 5 and 10% of our BPS budgets.
If we rewind a bit to when you were working on the commission around the funding, a lot of people might have been thinking, well, the state gives a lot of money to local school districts anyhow, so why does that need to change? And of course, you found out why in the commission, so explain. What is the reason?
Why do we even need to do this whole dramatic bill? Well, there's a few reasons. To try and give the speed tour, right? In 1993, we put in place a formula in our law in Massachusetts. It was a great concept. It was a watershed moment for Massachusetts, and I think a national model at its time, where we said, let's, before we even talk about who's going to pay, right, let's just figure out what it costs to deliver quality education anywhere in the state of Massachusetts, and that's what we call the foundation budget, right? And you think of it as the whole pie, right? Or if this is the foundation budget, after you add up all the books and the teachers and the superintendent and the school nurse and all the things you need to buy for an education, and then only once we figured out what that aspirational number is, we'll talk about how much local wealth is there in order to get to that number. And if the local wealth gets you here, the state will make up the difference. And if the local wealth gets you here, the state will make up that difference. And that was the basic concept of 1993. The problem that the 2015 commission found was that some of the numbers that we put into that formula, that foundation formula, had started out correct in 1993, but had sort of aged over time and had eroded in their value, and they weren't really predictive of reality. But the biggest problem that we found in the commission is that there were some numbers in that formula that were never right, even from the first day, even despite a good faith effort in 1993. In particular, the numbers that we put into the formula for what it costs to close opportunity and achievement gaps for low-income students and for English learners. And so the commission made specific recommendations about what the numbers should be in that formula, based on research about what works for closing those opportunity and achievement gaps. And it's more expensive than we thought it was a quarter century ago. But the good news is it is possible to close those gaps, but you really have to apply more effort. So this bill, all told, is going to be a $1.5 billion increase in state investment in the work of K through 12 public education, and the lion's share of that $1.5 billion is going to be targeted at closing those opportunity and achievement gaps for low-income students.
And I think one indication of changes is that there is probably, I guess, a larger percentage of students with learning disabilities now, and plus we have this whole more inclusive approach to teaching them. So I guess that would affect the funding needs too.
That was one of the shortfalls that that the commission found, is that the numbers that we used to predict how many students who will have IEPs of one kind or another and who will need some special education services was a little low. It was not drastically low, but it was a little low. And that's something that it touches every district across the state, right? Poor, wealthy, urban, rural, suburban, everyone has special education costs. So that was an adjustment that the commission recommended and that this law also carries out.
What about language learners? I mean, I guess aside from at least very recent years, Boston has this long history of not providing adequate education for that. How will things change for them, you think?
So there's a couple layers. I mean, one, I want to be clear with folks that while I am, deeply and enthusiastically celebrating this bill, this has been, the product of 5 or 10 years of work, depending on how you count it, both for me and for hundreds, if not thousands, of grassroots activists and other legislators and stakeholder groups across the state. So really worthy of celebration. It is an historic moment, and I think setting a new national model. But this bill is not a panacea. It is not going to solve everything that we need to do in K through 12 education. It is, as the name Foundation Budget suggests, a foundation. And we're going to need to layer other things on top of this in order to keep innovating and keep modernizing and bringing public education into the 21st century. So with respect to English language learners, there are a few things that, the money is necessary but not sufficient, right? So this bill is going to put in place additional funding to close those gaps for English learners, but it does not dictate exactly what, needs to be done with every dollar. And by design, a lot of flexibility is left to districts to make locally based decisions about what they see moving the dial best for the students in their schools. And in some cases, you might have, early elementary age students who are coming in for whom English, acquiring a new language is generally easier. And in some districts, you might have high school age students who are coming in, maybe with strong literacy in their native language, maybe with very little exposure to formal education in their native language in their native country. And that's a very different program, right, that you want to offer those two different types of students. And so we want to allow that kind of flexibility for districts to decide what their students need.
And of course, getting the money doesn't mean the state just gives a check to a local community. There's a process. So what's that going to be like?
Yeah, no blank checks here. And really, generally, the state does not do that. But one of the major requirements of this bill, and this is something that viewers should be looking out for pretty quickly over the next couple months, is that on April 1st, every district is required to submit to the state a written plan, and to publish it on their website so everyone can see it, for how they're going to use these dollars, particularly to target those opportunity and achievement gaps, and to serve underserved populations. And so that's a process, and we wrote it into the law that districts really need to be intentional and concerted in the outreach that they're doing, consulting with parent groups and educators to make sure that everybody's at the table in the drafting of those plans and making of those decisions about how folks want to use that money locally.
Talk about the context for this bill being passed too, because lately I've been seeing these stories, they're really more national stories than local, that the test scores are not really going up that much, even here locally. We're not improving that much, even though we're not one of the worst states. So people might be out there saying, maybe education reform isn't worth it. I mean, how does this make you feel?
Well, I mean, I think there's a danger in putting too much, all of your eggs in any one basket, right? With any one metric, whether it's test scores or graduation rates or college attendance and persistence, I mean, that's getting closer to a gold standard, or attendance rates or dropout, you really need to have multiple metrics in order to get a nuanced picture and a more accurate picture of what is the success rate of our schools. So looking at any one of the, saying, look, test scores are flatlining, this wasn't the right way, I would say, look, let's look at a few more metrics and see if it gives us a more complete picture. What I'm more concerned about, and what I see very, consistently across different metrics and different data sets, is not so much the flatlining of the average, right, for the total state or the total city, but when you peel back a layer and you start looking at subgroups of students, whether it's low-income students, Latino students, Black students, English language learners, is that although we have some of the highest averages in the nation here in Massachusetts, our gaps are also some of the largest in the whole country, and that is really that is something that we should not have pride about. We should have embarrassment about that as a state, and that again is what this bill is really targeted at. And those gaps, certainly, we have ceased to make progress by and large on closing those gaps, and in some cases they have even widened over the last 20-25 years. Certainly over the last 10 years, as funding has actually been trending down in public education. So, like I said, money is not the whole enchilada, right? You have to put the money in place to then be able to do good practice with it. We also have to, now that we've got the money in this bill, a lot of work is going to have to happen over the next months and years to layer the good practice on, so that we are recommitting and drilling down on those stagnant gaps, so that we're closing the gap between the have and the have-nots, and those who are achieving high and those who haven't been able to.
This is BNN News. We're talking with State Senator Sonia Chang-Diaz. So I want to go back to I guess more than a year ago, after your commission came out with this report, and there was this ambitious goal of $1 to $2 billion over X number of years, and a lot of people said fat chance,
yeah.
and then it just got bogged down in negotiations in the House. What's the difference between that and what happened this year?
A lot of faith and hard work, and yes, many people did say fat chance, that ain't never going to happen. But thankfully, a lot of advocates and parent groups and students and labor organizers, educators, municipal officials, civil rights groups, the list goes on. It's an incredible coalition that has been pushing this bill over the last 4 years. And folks just never gave up, right? They kept coming back at it. They were told fat chance. We went and organized, more and wider. And that has just been growing every year over the last several years. And we saw, eventually just a spread of local resolutions that have been passed by school committees and town councils all across the state, again, in urban districts, rural districts, suburban districts, large districts, small districts, so that, there was really a groundswell of demand for a big, to use Elizabeth Warren's words, a big structural change in the way that we're funding education and not just nibbling around the edges. And I really attribute this win to that persistence and that incredible organizing that has gone on both by allies inside the State House and by stakeholders outside of the State House, out in school districts, to just keep the press on and keep coming back and saying, no, we're not going to go home without this.
I do have one concern, because I've been through a few funding cycles in my time. Right now, state revenue is pretty robust. A few years from now, who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Could that be a threat to this?
Look, that is always the case with any state commitment to funding. Legislatures are, in Massachusetts, we are bound by the Constitution to pass a balanced budget every year. So this is part of the difficult work of legislating and writing a budget in any given year, is that yes, you have to make it all fit together in one puzzle. But this is the same thing that we did in 1993 when we first set out on this journey of education reform, and when, frankly, the Supreme Judicial Court said to the legislature, look, guys, you have a constitutional duty in our state constitution to cherish public education. You have to get this done. And that is what was largely the catalyst for the 93 Ed Reform Act. And so, look, this is our duty to figure this out. And we put in place in this law the guideposts, right, and the goalposts for where we want to be in 7 years from now and fully phasing this in. And just as the legislature had to do 1993 through 2000, they had to do the tough discipline decision making every year in the budget to follow through on the roadmap that the 1993 law laid out. But they, the 93 legislature can't bind the 1998 legislature, right? The 1998 legislature has to stick with it. And we're going to have to do that too over the next 7 years.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
State Senator Sonia Chang-Diaz. In a moment, the report from Dorchester with Bill Forey.